Welcome back to new session. This is continuation of stakeholder management knowledge area. In this session, we will study identify stakeholder process. The learning objective of this session are we'll go through the identify stakeholder process definition, input tool techniques output. We'll talk about some of the techniques like power interest grid, Salience model, stakeholder cube, stakeholder register, and we'll do a quick review. Stakeholder identification starts early and continue throughout the project lifecycle. It lays a foundation for a project success. Right stakeholder identification is the first step in the successful project execution. Knowing your stakeholder gives you ability to manage them effectively. Stakeholder identification helps project manager to define strategy to manage and engage stakeholders. Project involves various stakeholders. Some of them work closely, some of them watches from distance. You can consider three categories of stakeholder during stakeholder identification process. The first category of stakeholder to be considered are those within the project. That is the project team, which includes project manager and project management team. Second category of stakeholder are those outside of the project, but within the organization. This group includes sponsor, functional manager, and organizational groups. Then there is a third category that are outside of the organization. This group includes business partners, sellers or suppliers, customers or users, government regulators, and possibly other entities as well. Let's look at the identify stakeholder process definition. This is the process of identifying people, group, or organization that could impact or get impacted by decision, activity, or outcome of the project. The key benefit of this process is analyzing and documenting stakeholder interest, involvement, influence, and potential impact on the project success. Let's have a quick look at inputs, tool techniques, and outputs. Inputs are project charter, business documents, project management plan, project documents, agreement, enterprise environmental factors, and finally, organizational process assets. Project charter. It contains a list of key stakeholders and information about their responsibilities. Agreements. It may be contract, MOU, SLA. Agreement may provide details about stakeholders like buyer, seller or supplier, contract signatories. Business documents. Remember, business case and benefit management plan. These documents are created before project charter. Business case identifies project objectives and an initial list of stakeholders impacted by the project. Benefit management plan will list individuals and groups who will benefit from the project outcome. Project management plan. Communication management plan and stakeholder engagement plan may help identify stakeholder. Communication management plan provides communication register with list of stakeholder and their communication requirements. Stakeholder engagement plan will identify management strategies and actions required to effectively engage stakeholders. Remember, stakeholder identification happens throughout the project, hence this plan can be input once they are available. Project documents. Project documents like requirement documents, issue log, Change log can help to identify stakeholders. Requirement documents may provide information about potential stakeholders that are relevant to specific requirements. Issue log may contain stakeholder issues. New issues may introduce new stakeholders. Change log will list change requests raised by a stakeholder. Changes may introduce new stakeholders as well. Enterprise environmental factors can be useful in stakeholder identification. Organizational structure may help identify key influential stakeholders based upon their position. Organizational culture, governance structure, geographic distribution of facilities and resources, external agencies like government, labor union, etc. Organizational process assets like stakeholder register from previous or similar project can be useful to start quickly. Stakeholder register templates and guidelines can be useful, as well as lesson learned repositories. What are the tools and techniques useful for stakeholder identification? Expert judgment, meetings, data gathering techniques, data analysis, and data representation. Expert judgment. Expertise should be considered from the people who have specialized knowledge in understanding the politics and power structure in the organization, knowledge of the industry or type of project deliverables, knowledge of wider environment and culture including customers, knowledge of individual team members' contribution and their expertise. Expertise may come from project sponsor, project manager experienced in similar projects, functional manager, or subject matter experts. Data gathering techniques like brainstorming and questionnaire surveys can be useful for stakeholder identification. Brainstorming may help elicit input from team members or subject matter experts and identify many stakeholders. Individuals may brainwrite before attending workshops. Questionnaire and surveys may help get input from geographically distributed stakeholders. It can be one-to-one interviews, focus groups, or mass surveys. Once you have gathered the data through data gathering technique, how do you analyze them? That's through data analysis techniques like document analysis and stakeholder analysis. Document analysis. The lessons learned from previous project may contain information that may be help identify stakeholder for the current project. We will talk about stakeholder analysis in next slides. Stakeholder analysis analyzes relationship of stakeholder with or within the project. Ask questions like stakeholder is working on the project, affected by the outcome of the project, or affect the outcome of the project. What are the stakeholder stakes in the project? Stakes can be interest, where stakeholder is affected by outcome of the project, rights, legal or moral rights, ownership of an asset like machine used in the project, knowledge that can help the project, or contributions of funds, resources, or any kind of support to the project. Finally, stakeholder analysis results in list of stakeholder and relevant information like position, roles, stakes, expectations, attitude, and interest. Once you have analyzed the data through the techniques we learn, how do you represent them in order to prepare the stakeholder register? This is where data representation techniques helps project manager. Data representation is done through power, interest, impact, or influence grids, combining this grid with the directions of influence, also three-dimensional stakeholder analysis using stakeholder cube and Salience model. Let's understand various grids. Power interest grid, where grouping is done based upon the level of authority, that's a power, and level of concern, that's interest, regarding the project outcome. Power influence grid, where grouping is done based upon the level of authority, power, and their active involvement, that's influence in the project. Impact influence grid, where grouping is done based upon the ability to effect projects planning or execution, that's impact, and their active involvement, that's influence in the project. Let's see how it works in the next slide. Power interest grid. Power is plotted on the y-axis from low to high, and interest is plotted on x-axis from low to high. Graph is divided into 4 areas: high power, low interest, high power, high interest, low power, low interest, and low power, high interest. PM with the help of experts and team will document stakeholder interest and motivations, identify their conflicting interests, identify relationship between stakeholders, determine level of participation required by various stakeholders. Stakeholders are plotted on the grid. Based upon their position on the grid, strategy will be developed to manage these stakeholders. So how you will manage this stakeholder? Stakeholder with high power, low interest are kept satisfied. Stakeholder with high power and high interest are managed closely. Stakeholders with low power and low interest are monitored, and stakeholders with low power and high interest are kept informed. Power influence grid. It's a similar grid where power is shown on the y-axis and influence on the x-axis. This grid is used to identify power and level of influence of individual stakeholders, identify stakeholders that can make projects successful or unsuccessful, identify stakeholders whose influence evolves over a period of time, determine what are the communication media and style suits those stakeholders. Direction of influence. The influence part of the impact influence grid can go through further analysis through analysis of the direction of influence a person has. Direction of influence can be upward, where project manager is working with sponsor, senior management, stakeholders, steering committee. Outward, where project manager is engaging with customers, JV partners, suppliers, vendor, or other government agencies. Sidewards, where project manager deals with other project managers, functional managers who are competing for similar resources. And finally, downwards, where he is managing his team. Stakeholder cube. This is three-dimensional model. This is refinement of a grid model. It takes impact influence grid and adds a third dimension of attitude to the analysis. These techniques helps with prioritization of your stakeholder engagement efforts. Those stakeholders with high level of impact and or influence will obviously receive more of your attention or effort so that you can engage them. This grid divides stakeholder in two major categories, that is negative attitude and stakeholder with positive attitude. Negative attitude stakeholders are highlighted in red and positive attitude stakeholders are highlighted in green. The detailed understanding of this technique is out of scope of PMP exam. However, you can refer to associated slides for more details. Salience model. A project manager is likely to face the challenge in choosing the right stakeholder and prioritize their competing needs. Salience model brings clarity in importance of different stakeholders. The stakeholder salience is decided by assessment of their power, legitimacy, and urgency in the organization. Power is the ability of stakeholder to impose their will. Urgency is the need for immediate attention, action. Legitimacy is to assess if stakeholder involvement is appropriate or not. Further, stakeholders can be dormant stakeholder. So they have power but no urgency or legitimacy. Thus, the manager should be aware of them, but there is no need to plan for their needs. Expectant stakeholder, they have moderate salience, always expecting something from project manager. And third category is definitive stakeholder, the most important area in the model. You can see red highlighted in the middle. So this is where the power and legitimacy and urgency converge. The most critical category of a stakeholder, which is always to be kept informed, satisfied, and involved throughout the project lifecycle. Overall, there are 8 categories: dormant, discretionary, demanding, dominant, dangerous, dependent, definitive, and non-stakeholder. Again, detailed understanding of this technique is out of scope of PMP. However, you can refer to associated slides for more details. Meetings. Meetings are used to develop an understanding of significant project stakeholders through brainstorming techniques that gather and analyze data. Meetings can take a form of facilitation workshops, small group guided discussions, virtual groups using electronic or social media technologies. The output of meeting will be used to create forms of data representation which will help prioritize the engagement of stakeholder in next process. The output of identify stakeholder process is stakeholder register, which is the key output. In the same way that the initial risk management planning process creates the risk register, which is then modified throughout the remaining processes in the knowledge area. The initial stakeholder management process creates the stakeholder register, which is then modified throughout the remaining processes in the stakeholder management knowledge area. Next output is change request, project management plan updates, project document updates. What is stakeholder register? It is a project document including identification, assessment, and classification of a project stakeholder. Identification identifies name, organizational position, location, and contact details, role on the project, etc. Assessment helps you to understand major requirements, expectations, possible potential influence, phases with most influence or impact. Classification helps you to classify stakeholder as internal, external, what is their impact, influence, power, or interest, as well as understand the power, whether it is upward, downward, or outward. The stakeholder register is input to many processes. For example, it can be used during requirement gathering, which is collect requirement, quality management planning, communication management planning, risk management planning, to identify risk, procurement planning. Register will be updated with a new stakeholder as project progress. Remember, Stakeholder identification happens throughout the project. Next output is change request. The initial iteration of identifying stakeholder will not generate change request. However, as stakeholder identification continues throughout the project, new stakeholders or new information about the stakeholder may result in change request. Project management plan updates. The main component that will be updated is stakeholder engagement plan. Agreed upon communication strategies for identified stakeholders are recorded in the stakeholder engagement plan. Requirement management plan. Newly identified stakeholders can impact how requirement activities will be planned, tracked, and reported. So all this information will be updated in requirements management plan. Stakeholder communication requirements and agreed upon communication strategies are recorded in the communication management plan. If a stakeholder communication requirements and communication strategies affect the risk management approach on the project, then this is reflected in risk management plan. Project document updates. Assumption log. Most of the information about relative power, interest, and engagement level of stakeholder is based on assumption. Any constraints associated with interacting with specific stakeholders are updated in assumption log. Issue log. New issues raised as a result of identifying stakeholders are recorded in issue log. Risk register. New risk identified during this process of identifying stakeholder, as well as any changes to existing risk, are recorded in risk register. Good job. Here we complete identify stakeholder process. It's a long process with lots of input and tools and techniques, and of course stakeholder register as one of the key output. Let's do a quick review. What did we learn in this session? We learned about identify stakeholder process definition. We talked about various input, tool, techniques, outputs. We talked about stakeholder classification, classification models, power influence grid, power impact grid, Salience model, and finally stakeholder register. Thank you for staying with me. Keep the tempo up and going. See you in next session, which is plan stakeholder management. Thank you once again.